Hello and welcome to EESC 418A. This is lecture 11. Today we're talking about oral communication and in particular how to give presentations. So some of the key lessons I'll be talking about: how to understand your audience. This is very similar to what we talked about when we talked about how to write a report. Tell a story. Now this is similar to when we're writing a report, but in this case we can actually tell anecdotal stories. We can throw in something interesting for our audience that we might not put into a report. I'll talk a little bit about how to balance your material, because often in a presentation we are limited in time. We need to give the audience enough information so that they can understand the full story, but we then need to refer back to our audience analysis to understand how to balance that, how to give them enough information so that we're not wasting time and we're not giving anybody any redundant information, yet giving them the information they need to understand everything we're going to say next. I'll talk about reviewing. So there are a few ways we can review. This means reviewing our presentation slides for grammatical errors, but also practicing and doing dry runs. I'll talk about how to emulate engaging speakers and how to add value from the perspective of the audience. And finally, we'll go over some tips for question period. So similar to when we're writing a report, we want to do an audience analysis for a presentation. And in fact, I'd say the audience analysis is probably even more important for a presentation. We have lots of different types of audience that we might be speaking to in earth and environmental science. And I've listed a bunch here, starting with probably the easiest and moving on to the hardest. So the first couple of presentations that you'll give will most likely be to peers or classmates and professors. This is a relatively low pressure environment. So even though as you're giving your first one or two presentations of your life, as a scientist, you might feel a lot of pressure. Paradoxically, the pressure will go down as you give the more high stakes presentations, because you won't be giving a high stakes presentation, say to a judge and jury or to the media, until you've given lots of other presentations and gotten quite good at it. So I do think that even though the stressfulness of a type of presentation might go up, the stress that you feel while giving the presentation should go down as you become more experienced. So we'll start with peers and professors. These will be fairly understanding audiences. They know what you're here to do. You're here to practice. You're here to learn. You're not necessarily here to speak on behalf of any high stakes project or shareholders or stakeholders or other really heavily vested interests. So use these initial presentations as an opportunity to learn and to refine your presentation skills. When you get out in the workforce, you'll most likely be presenting to colleagues. This can be presenting scientific information, business information, or any other type of sort of an internal presentation. And this is also a good way to practice in a fairly low stakes and low pressure environment. In some of these presentations in the workplace, your boss may be there. Your boss may be there out of interest or to review what you're doing before you go present it externally. If you are in the world of academia, you might be presenting to students. Now, I've put students in this category separate from peers, thinking that this will be a type of presentation you give as a grad student, or if you become a professor, you'll now be presenting from some place of authority or some place of expertise, and the expectations on you will be a little bit higher than when you're a student. In the workforce, if you're a consultant, you might be presenting to clients. Now here the pressure does go up a little bit because the clients are paying quite high rates for you to do this work. They've paid you to produce a report and then to prepare to do a presentation and then to come and give a presentation. And so you giving that presentation likely will cost many thousands of dollars for that client. So they will have some pretty high expectations as to your level of preparation, your level of interest, your level of knowledge, and your overall quality of presentation. Next, we have the general public. This might be a presentation that you give, say if you're working for the government and you need to present the government's stance on some scientific topic or some environmental project. It might be something you present on behalf of a client. You might work for an NGO and you might be against a project. Whatever the case may be, you'll be speaking to the public, and generally, if you're speaking to the public, your objective here is now to do some sort of a persuasive talk. Similarly, you might be presenting to stakeholders or shareholders. And in these cases, you might want to emphasize the persuasive nature of your talk rather than the factual, although the factual is obviously still important and it needs to underpin everything you do as a scientist. It's just that the focus tends to shift a little bit as your audience shifts. Next, you might be presenting to regulators on behalf of a client or on behalf of a company that you work for. If you are in the field of earth and environmental science, often everything you need to do needs to be regulated and permitted and approved and authorized by government bodies. And in some cases, these authorizations require some sort of a presentation to them to help them understand some written material that you've produced. So this would be the case with an environmental impact assessment and lots of other types of smaller types of assessments that you might do. Next, we'll talk about expert witness training, and I have a special guest lecturer coming to talk about expert witness training, so I won't speak too much about this, except to say that this will be one of the most stressful types of presentation you can ever give, because you will have a number of lawyers who are ready to try and discredit you and to try and disprove everything you've said. So you need to have an extraordinary amount of prep going into one of these talks. Similarly with the media, it's not so much that the media might discredit you, but the media might take something you said out of context, so you need to be extraordinarily careful with your words. This will usually require a lot of training before you do any sort of media presentations, so I'll not say too much about that. If you do end up working somewhere where you're speaking directly to the media, you'll almost certainly go through some fairly rigorous media training before doing so, so I won't spend too much time on that. Okay, so let's talk about an audience analysis. Every member of your audience will have unique perspectives. Everything about your audience member will vary depending on the things I've listed on this slide. So they'll have a certain frame of reference. They'll have a certain set of values. These values and frames of reference will change how they look at everything. You can't anticipate the frame of reference or the values of every person in your audience. You just need to be aware that there will be lots of different types of values and lots of different types of judgments about what you're saying, assuming you have a fairly diverse audience. Your audience members will have a different level of interest. So they might be simply curious about what you're talking about. They might have read something in the newspaper and decided to come and listen to it or listen to you speak. Or they might be directly affected. If you're, again, speaking on behalf of some earth and environmental science project, you're probably affecting the environment in some way, and anybody who lives near that project will come out and want to learn more, and they may be for the project or against the project. And of course, if you're coming to speak on behalf of some project, a lot of people in the audience will have some bias already. They might be for the project, they might be strongly against the project, they might have some preconceived notions based on some other project that they've heard about somewhere else. They might have heard conflicting information if it's already been in the newspaper, for example. So you need to be really careful about biases and try and address them where you can, but they are very difficult to overcome. Your audience members might have different physiological abilities to understand what you're saying. They might have hearing impairments, so you need to speak very loudly if it's a large audience and you don't have a microphone, for example. So there are lots of different challenges related to the physical surroundings. If you're speaking outside, you need to speak quite loudly. If you have a good microphone, you have to be careful not to speak too loudly into the microphone. So you have to understand the abilities of your listeners. Those are just their physiological abilities, and then we also have the background information and their education. So in some cases, when you're giving a public talk, you might be giving a talk to a small crowd of people who are directly affected by the project, and in that case, they most likely know a lot about the project and don't need much background information. So you can gauge that by sort of asking a few questions at the start of your presentation. You know, is everybody here familiar with the project? Do I need to go over some of the basics, or can I get right into the science? And again, education. Don't assume that everybody in your audience is a scientist. You need to speak to them as lay people, and that doesn't mean dumb it down. It just means explain technical language, explain technical concepts where necessary. Another challenging part about giving presentations, particularly to the general public as a scientist, is understanding their motivation. So what do they hope to learn, and do they have a vested interest? In contrast, if you are a scientist speaking at a conference, you can assume that they've come to learn about the scientific aspects of your project and not so much the implications on the broader society or environment. So it's a really different type of emphasis that you'll put on these presentations, even though you might be talking about the same topic. And lastly, the authority. This goes back to the regulatory aspect of environmental science. In some cases, you're presenting to somebody who has authority over your project. This might be a client who has authority to cancel the budget that you have. It might be a regulator who has authority to approve or reject a project, or it might be some other type of authority. And in which case, you need to speak directly to their decision-making powers and to help them make the right decision. If you're giving a talk to the general public, keep in mind that there will be a range of level of engagement in that public audience. So most people, when they come to hear a talk, and this is based on experience, this is not a formal survey, but I've been to a lot of talks where I've been giving the talks, and I've also gone to a lot of talks just out of general interest because I'm sort of fascinated by the dynamic of the crowd. So I've gone to a lot of public talks about environmental projects that I'm not involved in just to sort of watch the crowd dynamics. And this is what I've seen. The vast majority of people there, so basically the middle of this bell curve, are mildly interested. They're there to learn more. They don't have a strong opinion, and they really want to really just learn and to take in the information. But of course, when it comes to question period, it's going to be dominated by the people on the left and the right. So the people who stand up and make sort of long-winded questions and ranty comments are the people who are deeply passionate either for or against the project. They're there to really make themselves heard. They're not there so much to learn about the project. They've already made their opinion. They're there to sort of make their opinion heard. So you'll see this in public presentations. This is very common. And so as a presenter, you need to really think to yourself, which group do you primarily speak to? My opinion would be to try and speak to that middle group. That's the vast majority of the people who are there to learn, who are there to possibly change their minds one way or another, and are really open to take in your information. And the people that you're going to hear about during question period, unfortunately, in a public presentation, are generally the people who are not there to change their minds. But when you answer their questions, remember that there's a large audience of people who are somewhat interested and open to learn. And so when you're answering the questions from the people who are strongly for or against your project, you can actually answer in a way that will inform the people in the middle who are listening and paying attention to the question and answer period. So if you're giving a presentation, try telling a story. This means telling a story from start to finish about your technical project, but it also means you can tell stories throughout. Begin with the general information, move from concrete to specific facts. Just like when we write a report, we want to start general, move into the specifics, and come back to the very general. And you've seen some of the reading material that I've assigned. It refers to this as the hourglass because it starts wide, goes in narrow, and comes back wide, just like an hourglass. So you can use signposts and transitions. These can be verbal segues from one topic to another, or they can be transition slides, but you want to let your reader know where you're going, your audience know where you're going. And then refer back to the big picture. So for example, my big picture here is helping you become a better oral presenter. And to become a better oral presenter, you want to tell a story. So refer back to the objectives of your study when you're giving a presentation, whenever you can. And you can do this multiple times throughout a presentation as you're giving facts and figures. You can refer back to how those meet the objectives of your study. It does help to speak chronologically, particularly if you're talking about, for example, a field study. You started with an objective, you did a plan, you implemented that plan, you analyzed the results, you presented the results, and now here we are with your final thoughts. So a lot of the overall structure of a technical report can be presented chronologically. And you can incorporate anecdotes. So I'll incorporate an anecdote here. So when I was in grad school, I was not a very good presenter. I feared presentations horrendously. I spent tons and tons of time stressing about how to give a presentation. And as part of grad school, we all had to go through what was called a seminar. And in the seminar, each grad student took turns, one per week, giving a presentation on essentially a literature review. It was a separate topic, somewhat related to our thesis, but not the topic of our thesis. And we didn't actually write a literature review, we just read a lot of literature and then had to give a presentation on it. So my topic was endocrine disruptors in the environment. So endocrine disruptors are essentially chemical compounds that mimic hormones and cause physiological changes within us. So for example, pharmaceuticals that get flushed down the toilet, get washed through a sewage treatment plant, discharged to a river, they can have effects on fish, but they can also have effects on humans who drink that water. So that was the topic of my presentation. I find it super fascinating, super interesting. So it's something I'm deeply passionate about. I'm not super knowledgeable about it though. I haven't actually ever worked in that field, and I've read a little bit about it. So I was knowledgeable to the point where I could speak about it, and our presentation had to be 45 minutes. So back in those days, my method for giving a presentation was always the same. I would write out the entire script of every single word I was going to say, and then I would memorize that script to the best of my ability. And so I spent about a week, pretty much the entire week, reading and rereading and trying to read out the script in my head and memorize the script and writing it out on little index cards and giving the presentation over and over and over again to the mirror. It was extremely stressful. It wasn't very fun at all. When I gave the talk, I made it through the talk. My supervisor came over and told me I'd passed, but barely, because he saw that I was using crib cards. It was a pass or fail presentation, so it was pretty high stakes, but I did pass. But he really said, you know, I could tell you were reading from the cards. It wasn't a very compelling talk. It was technically accurate, but it was not very compelling. So he recommended I never do that again. And in fact, I've never done that again. Ever since then, I've practiced in a different way. And you'll see some of the reading material that I've assigned will make recommendations on how to give a presentation. One of those ways is to present to the mirror or to another friendly person, perhaps a spouse or a parent or a good friend, somebody who's not going to judge you but actually provides that little bit of feedback of presenting to another human being. And you present it without any notes, and you just basically present the material, and every time you stumble, it helps you understand which part of it you need to rehearse. But the main thing is just really being able to know your material enough that you don't need cue cards. If you're using cue cards, it's sort of like a politician who's speaking into a teleprompter. You have that risk that the teleprompter is going to shut off or you're going to lose your place. And if you do, you are going to be in a lot of trouble. So you're going to have dead space, you're going to be thinking about where you were in the presentation, it's going to be awkward and stressful. It's much better to be able to speak without crib notes, to have practiced a few times telling the information and the story that you want. And each time you practice without any sort of memorization, you will get better at it. So use that first slide to capture people's attention and that closing slide to offer solutions. And I've linked to another good talk. I think I referred to it as the MIT lecture on how to give a presentation. I referred to it in both lecture 10 and 11 because it is such a very interesting, compelling, informative, holistic view on how to give a presentation. I've watched it a few times and I've picked up on a few things that I've been doing wrong for many years. So do give that one a watch. It's very good, particularly talking about how to structure your slides to tell a compelling story and how to make the most of the slides. So one of the things I learned from that is to not have a closing slide that has the word questions with a question mark at the end. And he has some jokes about why not to do that. I've been doing that all my life and I will not do that anymore. So have a look at that talk by the MIT professor. So you want to have a typical outline. You want to have a cover slide, of course. In your slides, you will go through the introduction, background, and problem formulation. If you can weave this into a story, that's really great. It won't always be that easy to tell a story, but think of your outline as a story you're going to tell and do the best you can with that. It won't always be easy to tell a story, but think of that body as a place where you can tell the story. So we had some methods, we found some results, here's your discussion, and in the end, you're going to have a summary, conclusions, or recommendations. All of this is going to be some sort of a narrative that you're speaking to inform and to enlighten your audience. Okay, I mentioned earlier that we're going to try and balance our material. So I've listed a few of the key elements of a presentation and then the risk of having too much or not enough of that material. So for example, our background. If we have too much background, we waste precious time. A typical talk at a conference, for example, will be 20 minutes, which is usually not enough time to get into a lot of detail about our project. However, if we don't have enough background, we will lose our audience. They won't understand what we're trying to do. They might not understand our objectives, our study site, and if we've lost our audience in the background, we've lost them for the rest of the presentation. So put a lot of thought into the exact amount of information that needs to go into your background. Okay, try not to present too much data. Your data might be interesting to you, it might be interesting to your colleagues, but the vast majority of your audience, and this is the same with a public audience or a highly technical and specialized audience at a conference, they don't want to see your data. They want to see a couple of graphs maybe. They don't want to see a ton of information about data points. Now, the flip side is if you don't have any data, you're going to lose credibility because in any scientific presentation, you need to have some supporting data to help the audience understand the underlying basis of your claims. So again, this is going to be a balance. The way to balance your data presentation is usually to use compelling figures. And again, I've linked to a TED Talk that really makes great use of figures. This is a world-class presentation. I'm not expecting everybody to have their figures in such a compelling way as what's in this TED Talk, but it really gives something to aspire to. So, number of words on the slide. Try not to have too many. There's really no minimum number of words. I often give presentations that are only pictures. It is usually good to have a few words on the slide. It's nice to have some cues to yourself as a presenter, but it's also nice to have some context for somebody who might get a printed version of your presentation. Okay, and the next thing is repetition. A lot of really authoritative sources emphasize the fact that you need to have some repetition because in a presentation, people might not pick up on your key point if you only say it once. A lot of the sources say you should have key points repeated at least 3 times through your presentation, once at the start, once worked into the body, and then once in the closing. Now, too much repetition can become annoying. It might come across to your audience as if you're sort of trying to brainwash them or something into believing your key point. So you have to balance this. Again, this whole slide is about things you need to balance. So you don't want to repeat your key point too many times, but it might be useful to repeat it once at the start and once at the end. And then the number of slides. If you have too many slides, you're going to need to rush your way through it. If you don't have enough slides, you're going to not have enough interesting content to speak to. So I'll give another example, another anecdote about an epic fail on my part. I have a talk that I used to give. It usually took close to an hour. If I was giving it to junior staff where I worked, it was all about best practices for how to use an environmental model. And it had a lot of, hands-on sort of practical tips and information. And I turned it into a conference paper and I presented it in Leipzig, Germany. So I'd flown a third of the way around the world to give this talk. I'd not really prepared too much for it because I'd given it many times internally. And I thought, well, it's a piece of cake. The only difference is that my timing's going to be shorter. And I did not pay attention to the number of slides I had. And so I tried to squeeze a 1-hour talk into 20 minutes without really paying attention to my slide count. So what I should have done is gone back and reduced the number of slides by about a third and really focused on what is the key information for this different audience. However, I failed to do an audience analysis and I failed to pay attention to the number of slides. So it was a 20-minute presentation, and after 15 minutes, they had a little red light that turned on to give you a 5-minute warning. And in fact, they wanted you to wrap up within the next couple of minutes to leave a few minutes for questions. And I wasn't even through my introduction yet, and that red light came on, and I realized I haven't actually even said anything useful to the audience. And so this was a horrible, epic fail. I'd spent thousands of the company's dollars on this trip over to Europe. I'd spent about a week preparing for it. Well, not preparing for the talk, but preparing for the conference. And it was a total epic fail. It was not paying attention to the number of slides, and it was a real lesson. And I'll come back to that lesson in a couple of slides because it actually reinforces another lesson I'm going to talk about. So, body movement. A lot of the references that I've looked up on how to give a good oral presentation, including the ones I've linked to, talk about body movement and having that right balance of hand gestures, eye contact, walking gently around the stage, sort of, some subtle movements, but definitely not having too much movement, so not waving your arms, not turning your back, not jumping around and being too animated. That's a real balancing act. I can't say that I'm an expert in that area. I think the hand gestures that people use and the body language is something that comes naturally to a lot of people. So if you are sort of awkward or uncomfortable as a presenter, it might be something you want to focus on watching yourself in the mirror or having somebody watch you and sort of coach you a little bit on how much body movement and body language would be natural. Have somebody help you with that. Have somebody who's impartial, that you don't mind judging you, to guide you through that process a little bit if you're learning how to give a talk. Okay, so review meticulously. This means a couple of things. Number one, you want to review your slides for any sort of errors. You don't want to have any grammatical errors on your slides. They're distracting and they break trust. So your audience will get the message that you don't care enough about them to fix any typos, to go through the time and effort to make everything look good. There are a couple of really common errors that I see in presentations. Number one is inconsistent capitalization of headings. A lot of people will give presentations that have inconsistent capitalization on the headings on their slide, on the slides themselves, on any text. Some people just capitalize every bullet point, every word in every bullet point. Maybe they do that on one slide, on the next slide it's sentence case. It's these little things, they're not exactly fatal flaws, but it really implies to the audience that you didn't have the time or the effort to make it really nice and easy and not distracting for them to read. Another big problem with scientific talks is undefined acronyms. If you have a purely technical audience, that might be okay. You don't want to waste your time defining acronyms that everybody knows. However, you need to be really careful with that and go through the audience analysis to understand. So for example, you can see at the bottom of my slide, I've got the acronyms UBC. I'm pretty sure everybody at UBC knows what UBC stands for. And I've got EESC. I'm pretty sure everybody who's in this class knows what EESC stands for. So I didn't define those acronyms. However, if I were to give this presentation to another audience, perhaps at a conference somewhere, I wouldn't use EESC. I would spell out Earth and Environmental Science, or at least spell it out once and let people know what EESC means. So again, it comes down to who is your audience and will they know what your acronyms are. Check for the 5 W's. You can go through your slides and ask yourself the questions. Did you cover the who, what, where, when, and why? And of course, how? And that's a useful question to ask if you're trying to tell that story, because your audience will have those questions in their head if you haven't answered them, at least implicitly somewhere in your presentation. Okay, so prepare thoroughly. I said I would come back to my talk that I gave in Germany. So rehearse but don't memorize. This was my problem, is I'd rehearsed it but never for the right timing. I'd given this talk many times with the 1 hour or 45-minute timing, but I hadn't rehearsed with the 20-minute timing. So I failed that miserably. It was pretty awkward. Anyway, so do some dry runs. It doesn't matter who you're presenting to ultimately. If it's a public presentation or presenting to the media or at a conference or presenting to our class, do some dry runs with somebody that is not judgmental, somebody who will just sit there and give you a focus to make eye contact with and to give you a little bit of pressure. You need a little bit of pressure in your talks, otherwise you're not going to perform well. So think about this graph on the right. This is called the Yerkes-Dodson Law of 1908. You've probably seen this in one form or another. Essentially what it says is your performance will be related to your level of stress. So if you have no stress whatsoever, you're not going to perform well because you're not motivated. If you have too much stress, you're not going to perform well because you're going to be burnt out or fatigued or overstressed, and you're going to have breakdown. We want to shoot for that middle level of stress to have optimal performance. And the way to do that with a presentation is to start off doing multiple presentations until we're comfortable with the material. So if you don't like giving presentations, and lots of people don't, that's very common, you might start off in that distress zone, but each time you give the presentation, you'll become a little bit more comfortable with the material, and hopefully you'll nudge yourself back into that eustress zone and have optimal performance when the time comes to give the actual presentation. So focus on your tone. You want to be serious, formal, and assertive. You don't want to be too casual or flippant. You don't want to make any silly comments. And then finally, no matter how much you've practiced, you have other ways that you can calm down. So deep breathing, meditation. I would highly recommend doing some slow breathing, box breathing, or some other fixed breathing method before your presentation to slow yourself down, to calm yourself down, and to give yourself the best shot you have at giving a nice, calm, clear presentation. This will help you speak more clearly, and it will also help you enjoy the presentation a little bit more because you're in a better state of mind. So I mentioned TED Talks earlier. TED Talks are really great. There's lots and lots of good TED Talks. Almost all of them will give you good ideas about how to speak if you watch them. I've linked to a few on the lecture page that I think are really engaging and that use their figures really well. So look at the way they give their talks, at the way they make eye contact, look at their body language. Particularly look at the way that they will tell a story, referring occasionally to their figures to reinforce the story and to make it more interesting. So if you can emulate a TED Talk, you're doing very well. And I would suggest watching a bunch of these before you give a talk and just sort of try and put yourself in their mindset of getting up there, speaking with confidence about something you're passionate about, and effectively using your presentation figures. So remember to bring value to the audience. And what I've said here is put yourself in the audience. I didn't say put yourself in the audience's shoes. Put yourself in the audience as if you are sitting in the audience watching yourself. Think to yourself, what is it that I, as an audience member, and remember your audience is not just some random person, but the specific type of person that you identified in your audience analysis, whether it's somebody from the public, a regulator, a judge and jury, a media member, peers, professors, whoever it is that you're presenting to, think about that person and try and be that person and think about what they want and need to hear. If you can inform, enlighten, entertain, and engage them, the more of those things you can do, the better. But particularly, you're there to inform and enlighten if you're giving a scientific talk. And then go through your slides and cut any part of your presentation that doesn't bring that value to your audience. So you need to be really honest with yourself about, is there anything in this presentation that my audience really doesn't care about? Is there something that I just feel like talking about that my audience isn't going to care about? If so, then cut that out and focus on the part that they are going to value. Now, lastly, this is usually the last thing that you'll do when you give a presentation, is to answer questions. So every type of presentation format will have a different set of rules for how the questions can be asked and answered. So the most important thing here is to know the rules of engagement. For example, in a conference presentation, there will be very well-defined number of minutes for presentation, number of minutes for questions. And there will be lights and visual cues to tell you when you're going off track, and people will actually stop you if you've spoken too long. So the rules are quite strict. If you're giving a public presentation, You might invite people to put their hand up or to stand up at any time, or you might ask them to wait until the end. But with a long presentation with a diverse audience, it's usually best to ask them to hold their questions until you've completed each section, and then within your presentation you'll have section breaks and you'll pause and ask for questions so that people aren't having to remember questions in their head while they're watching your presentation. I find that to be the most effective format. So questions after each section for a public presentation. But no matter what type of presentation you're giving, there will almost be questions at the end, and often, whether it's public or conference or some other format, there will be an open mic with a moderator who will go around and hand out the mic, or a podium where people will come up to introduce themselves and ask a question. So I'll talk mostly about that because it is the most common format. So embrace question period. It's an opportunity for you to sharpen your mind, to think to yourself, to think on your feet, and to really test your knowledge. It's also an opportunity for you to refine future presentations. If people are asking you the same type of question, perhaps it is something you should have included in your presentation, and you can do that next time. It's always good to clarify the question, and there's two reasons for this. Number one, if somebody asks you a question, if you rephrase the question back to them in your own words, it shows that you understand the question, which is useful to them to let them know that you understood them. It's also useful to you because then you can answer the question that you know was asked and not answer some other question that somebody meant to ask. And the reason I say that is because when somebody's asking a question at a scientific talk, they might not understand the material enough to answer. They might not understand the material well enough to ask you the question they really want to know. So repeating them back to them is good for those two purposes, but it's also good for another purpose. If somebody stands up and asks you a question, chances are they're not speaking into a mic, or they might be speaking into a mic, but they might not be speaking clearly. And a lot of people in the audience will not understand their question. So when you go to answer their question, if you repeat that question back to them through your mic and through your scientific lens, it really helps the rest of the audience understand the question before you answer it. So take some time to think before speaking. If you're giving a presentation and you're a scientist, you generally want to come across as somebody who's knowledgeable and authoritative. However, you don't want to jump in and just answer the first thing that comes to your mind, because you are there to give people value. You want to give them a really meaningful answer. So it's not a bad idea just to say, good question, let me think about that for a second. And you can take a couple seconds. It might feel a little bit awkward to have some dead space, but if you've given them a quick warning that you're going to think about it, here's a couple of second pause. There, that was 3 seconds. That wasn't so bad. Now I can answer the question. Okay, so thank you for your question. I've given that some thought, and probably the best answer I can come up with is X, Y, and Z. Okay, but also don't be afraid to say, I don't know. If you've thought about it and you say, that's a really good question. To tell you the truth, I don't know the answer to that question. It didn't come up in my study. It's definitely something I should think about as we move forward with our study. Or you can say, that's a really good question, but unfortunately it's not within the scope of my study, and it's also not within my scope of expertise, although somebody else might be interested in taking that up as a study in the future. It's just not something we looked at. So those are really the best two answers if you don't know. You can speculate depending on the type of presentation you're giving, if it is something you're interested in and you do have an opinion. But if that's the case, just make sure you're very clear that you're saying, this is off-the-cuff speculation. This is not a factual answer that comes directly from my data. So you can just give that caveat. I haven't studied that, but based on this other line of evidence or this other study that I've read somewhere, here's an idea that might be useful. So as long as you've given that caveat, it's not so bad to give an off-the-cuff answer. But it kind of depends on the forum. And the key point there is just clearly identify speculation and opinions if you're giving them. But no matter what, stick to the scope of your expertise. I have seen people answer questions that were way outside of their scope of expertise before. It just really takes away from your credibility to kind of speculate on things that are completely unrelated to your study and unrelated to your expertise. Never be afraid to just say, I'm sorry, that's not really within the scope of my expertise or my presentation, or I'm not sure, I didn't look at that, but I can check with somebody and get back to you after if you want to give me your contact information after this talk. So that's a perfectly acceptable way of doing that. But the bottom line is, don't be afraid of question period. It is a good chance for you to do a little bit of extra thinking, to sharpen your mind, to refine your skills for next time. Okay, well, this is it for oral presentations. See you all when you give your presentation, or perhaps you're seeing this after you've given your presentation, but in any case, remember to be calm, do some deep breathing, lots of practicing, and don't be too stressed out. Do whatever you need to do, whether it's practicing or anything else, to get yourself into that lower stress zone so that you can do an optimal performance when you give your presentation. Okay, see you next time.